welcome to this month's episode of Fintech Firebrand. I'm Virginie O'Shea, founder of Firebrand Research, and I'm here to chat to you about February's FinReg and Fintech news. Now, given that I'm in the UK, one of the biggest topics this month in Fintech and FinReg has been the discussion around Bitcoin, or the introduction of a central bank digital currency to replace the pound or cash that's used in the UK. Now, CBDCs have been much discussed by many other regulators across the globe. Singapore's MAS has been talking about it for quite some time, done some pilot work over the last year or so. We've even seen a lot of discussion last year about the digital dollar in the US. So nothing new really in terms of the concept, but certainly something that the UK seems to be focusing on increasingly as it tries to position itself post-Brexit as a global hub, trying to retain its, or recapture its crown within Europe as one of the major markets above some of the other markets in continental Europe. So it'll be interesting to see how this work evolves around the CBDC. Certainly, I'm one of the skeptics about how easy it will be for a central bank to launch such a currency, but they have a relatively long paper to read on the topic, and they're talking about taking it relatively slow, actually, which is probably a good thing in terms of the consultation, and that period has just started now. Expect many more papers and discussions throughout the next year on the topic, and I will see that as well in the US and many other jurisdictions as more and more countries explore what a CBDC might look like. From an EU FinReg front, we also have seen many discussions hosted by ESMA over the last couple of weeks on the topic of the Digital Operational Resilience Act. I actually sat through, I think it was around about 4 or 5 hours of discussion last week talking about DORA, and it was a session where industry participants were able to call in and ask questions of ESMA and the other EU level regulators, including the EBA and the pensions regulator at the EU level, EOPS, about what they were worried about with regards to the incoming regulation. Now, there were many different aspects that were covered, lots of discussion about how to monitor outsourced providers and to find out technology details, fintech details of who your providers are using, even within intragroup arrangements can be tricky. With regards to smaller asset managers in particular that are captive asset managers of larger organizations. So certainly a lot of meat to discuss on that topic. And there's going to be many more consultation periods throughout this year. ESMA seems very open to feedback. They were taking many notes. You could hear them talking and asking questions back of the people that were asking them questions to clarify certain points, and they were making frantic notes. So it looks like the regulatory technical guidelines are being drafted for DORA, and the industry can have a say in what those look like. Particularly, there's been a lot of discussion about how to monitor cloud providers, how to get information from cloud providers in a consistent manner across the different big providers out there, the 3 big ones. So if you have an opinion, I would encourage you to send your comments, clarifications, questions, anything to ESMA or any of the other regulators, as they are willing to listen. Now, across the pond, we've had a few FinReg developments. The US House Financial Services Committee, US House Banking Committee, rather, had yet another meeting with people giving evidence on the topic of crypto assets. Now, a lot of this discussion is repetitive. I will not lie. I've listened to a lot of it over the last year or so, and the same arguments seem to be put forward for why crypto assets should be kept out of the existing banking system. And then there's the argument that the innovation is something that should be encouraged, and the US should not fall behind other countries with regards to digital assets. So there doesn't seem to have been too much progress thus far. There's been a lot of trash talk about the SEC from certain contingents out there, and definitely think that Gensler is going to be before that committee, before the planned September discussion. I think he'll be called ahead of time, because certainly this seems to be a very big topic that everyone wants to move forward with and have some clarity on. So it wouldn't surprise me if in the next month he's called ahead and has to present to the regulators there, or the senators there, to discuss some of the crypto asset stuff. Now, I think given that only, what was it, 16% of US investors have actually invested in crypto assets, this might be slightly blown out of proportion. Obviously, FTX was a very big deal, but again, there are other things to be getting on with it. The SEC has been doing a hell of a lot of work in other areas. One other area that's very interesting, that seems to be somewhat slowed down now, is the ESG side of things. They seemingly have gone back, as is the way with many regulations. They've gone back to the drawing board and are reviewing some of the proposals they made. They received a huge number of comments. Unsurprising, I think it was something like 15,000 comments from the industry about their ESG proposals, much of which was very negative. A lot of pushbacks going on. Obviously, it's a particularly politically contentious topic in the US, more so seemingly than any other jurisdiction thus far. So it will be interesting to see what the revisions are, whether they're kept broadly in line with what's going on in the rest of the world. That's a open question. I know that US regulators have been meeting with the EU regulators over the last couple of weeks as well, to try and foster some sort of a global framework on key topics, ESG being one of them, crypto being another, of course, cybersecurity being a very big topic, lots of learnings and discussions around that. Obviously, the CFTC and the US Treasury woke up to talking about cybersecurity this month as well. So we've seen some public statements about concerns there. We had the ION software, the trading software hack, the ransomware attack that happened, that has obviously shocked a lot of different regulators and industry participants, woken up a lot of firms to the fintech challenges you may have, where fintechs are being targeted by cyber criminals. So certainly that's a lot of discussion there that needs to be sort of codified into pieces of regulation in the US. I know that there's been some moves by the SEC already. There's been discussions last year, but the CFTC seemingly has gotten that bandwagon as well. So interesting to see that happen too. And of course, one of my perennial topics, and we're going to be doing an event in London next month on, is the move to shorten the settlement cycle in the UK. Obviously, there's been a lot of announcements by people joining the Accelerated Settlement Task Force, who's being tasked with providing or putting together recommendations for the UK government and all of the other, I guess, industry participants with regards to shortening the settlement cycle to T+1 here in the UK. Obviously, in the US, there's a lot of pressure on the SEC to confirm the timeline for their move. A lot of people saying that the March timeline that the SEC originally proposed, which was, at the start of last year, is unfeasible, so that they need to look at that and revisit it and confirm for the industry when the timeline is actually going to be. I know there's also pushback that it may be a bit longer than anticipated. It might be beyond the Labor Day date that people are proposing in September of 2024. So let's see, shall we, and see what the recommendations are there. But certainly T+1 chat is something that is going to continue on, and of course, once we've had that event, I will report back as to what's gone on there with regards to Firebrand research. And I'm also working actively on a paper looking at some of the findings related to CSDR, and that's a big topic with regards to penalty payments and what happens with the review process this year. So lots of open questions, but certainly post-trade efficiency is a huge deal in Europe and beyond. And now for my final thoughts, just an interesting news story that happened earlier in the month as well, that maybe not many people noticed, that Robinhood had to cancel some of its bonuses for the last year because of an error related to a corporate action, in fact. So the focus on asset servicing is rare, and it's often, ignored in terms of how important it is, but it can be an extremely expensive thing to do if you get it wrong. And Robinhood shareholders were able to trade shares they didn't actually own, which was a bit of an error there. So Robinhood had to hold a temporary short position in the stock, and there were some problems with regards to that meant there was a lot of money spent in that era. So certainly that impacted all of their bonuses, and something that impacts governance and the perception of an organization. So something I think we should all bear in mind is that asset servicing may not be the sexiest topic in the world, but as I've repeatedly talked about, it is incredibly important, and it is part of the G in ESG. We're going to see much more focus on some of these topics with regards to shareholder activism, I believe, as part of the ESG agenda. Particularly in Europe, we're seeing a lot more activity by shareholders on the institutional and to some extent the retail side, not as much, but pass-through voting is enabling some of that. So hearing the voice of the shareholder is a big theme for the Capital Markets Union as well. So I expect all of these topics to be big in the next year, next 12 months, next 11 months, actually, since as we're now in February, hasn't time flown, but certainly that is something to bear in mind as well. Asset servicing, it's important.